There is no need to introduce Ronald Inglehart the second time. Everybody knows him by now. He'll present his second lecture on modernization and inequality. Trump, Brexit, and populism. Fascinating topic.
Thank you. To maybe start off the discussion, I could come to basically inequality is rising. I think it's well known, it's much discussed. It is something that is an economic problem, and it is one with a political solution. I would say that inequality at any time reflects a balance between market forces and state intervention. All states, all societies offset a basic natural tendency for inequality to rise, which is rooted in the fact that you start off with some advantages and they tend to snowball. People who are born into comparatively prosperous families get better nutrition before they're even born. They get better nutrition when they are born, and better health care and more intellectual stimulation, and they go to better schools, and they make better, more influential social contacts, and the whole thing snowballs to the point where inequality tends to grow. This is a basic tendency in all societies. There's nothing new. All societies have some way of offsetting this by encouraging, in traditional societies, in hunting and gathering societies, they emphasize sharing. It's a very big norm. Sharing with the others is, even if you are the best hunter in the tribe, there are severe social pressures to share, and you run into real trouble if you don't. In medieval Christian society and in many societies, Islam and so forth, norms of charity and almsgiving and feasts where the rich invite the poor to share food are powerful social norms reflecting the fact that all societies, to some extent, try to offset this natural tendency toward inequality. In modern societies, it is not informal social pressure, it is not the church, it is the state which provides the most effective provider of offsetting the natural tendency for inequality to rise. So inequality reflects the balance of power between elites and masses. It is much greater in some societies than in others. As Karl Marx noted, and many anthropologists have noted, hunting and gathering societies are relatively egalitarian. The reason is political in large part. They're egalitarian because of two reasons. There are not large differences in private property. You can own what you can carry, and that is, you don't build up enormous fortunes like Donald Trump or like Bill Gates. Basically, you may be able to carry a few more things than somebody else, but the economic inequality is not so great that it is not transmitted from generation to generation and so on. And another very important thing is this lack of private property, the limits to private property is well noted. The other important thing that's less noted is that political skills are evenly distributed. Very important thing, word of mouth communication is sufficient in hunting and gathering societies. In more developed societies, you need to go to schools and eventually the higher school of economics to get advanced degrees in order to enter politics, and you go to Harvard Law School and become editor of the Harvard Law Review, and you get to become president. But it's a whole series of different skill levels. It starts with agrarian societies. Large agrarian societies exist and become powerful enough to crowd out smaller societies because they're much bigger. And the reason they are able to be bigger is because they are coordinated by literate bureaucracies. They are specialized elites that have specialized skills. Military skills, well-equipped, trained soldiers are part of the story. And the elite, literate elites, the bureaucratic elites in China, the Mandarin elites, in medieval Europe, there was Christian priests who were part of the ruling hierarchy, they were illiterate, and you have to have at least literacy to command a large society. There are various forms. The Incas had a limited form of literacy, but they had ways of communicating using specialized skills. And this makes social differentiation evolve. Agrarian societies tend to become very unequal, have enormous differences between the landowning elite and the peasants or serfs or peons or slaves who do the work and make up most of the population. And this is rooted in the existence of private property, as a Marxist view would emphasize, but also different political skills. The existence of organized political elites who can communicate and keep records and send out instructions and coordinate large empires which are powerful and thus tend to, the big fish devour the little fish. The big empires tend to dominate and absorb the smaller ones. This is, I would say, a basic element. Political skills are necessary. It is not sufficient in a hunting and gathering society if you can talk, as virtually all humans can. You can communicate in the council, the village council, by word of mouth. In a big agrarian society, you need literacy. And most of the population becomes politically irrelevant. The illiterate peasants scattered over the countryside are unable to communicate. They may have scattered rebellions, and often do have scattered rebellions, but they are regularly put down by centrally coordinated troops sent by controlled by a literate administrative bureaucracy. So inequality goes with differences in skills. Early industrial society was also dominated by a small industrial elite that dominated huge numbers of workers, producing very high levels of inequality. And the work of Karl Marx is set as a critique of this phase of society, of huge inequality in early industrial society. This was not the end of the story, however. Urbanization and mass literacy enabled the working class to mobilize, and of course, ironically, the Marxist ideology stimulated the organization of labor unions and labor-oriented political parties and contributed to a change in the nature of industrial society. It enabled the working class to mobilize for economic and political bargaining in labor unions and working class-oriented political parties that eventually captured power in various countries and implemented social welfare programs that redistributed the wealth, that provided free education for more or less everyone and various public health measures. And largely as a result of this political factor, economic inequality declined throughout most of the 20th century. A huge element. Piketty's famous analysis tends to restrict itself to economic factors and see this as a kind of, the norm is rising inequality. Well, I think he's right on this, though for somewhat different reasons. He says it's because the return to capital tends to exceed the growth of the economy, in which case you automatically get inequality. I think that there are reasons involving political skills and political mobilization that largely explain the rising economic equality of most of the 20th century. It was not a sort of random shock, as Piketty argues. It was very important systematic forces, mobilization of the working class. So economic inequality declined throughout most of the 20th century. This used to be the happy story, of sort of things are getting better and better, but they didn't always get better and better. Since about 1970, things have not been getting better and better in many ways. First, with the rise of the service sector, as we move from industrial society to post-industrial society, automation and outsourcing replaced the jobs of large numbers, most industrial workers. This class that Marx saw as becoming the overwhelming majority actually dwindled to a small minority. And huge amount, this weakened, of course. Organized labor lost its bargaining power because they were less numerous and because their jobs could be and were outsourced to China, Bangladesh, India, and automation replaced the less skilled jobs. But it was okay during the rise, the era of post-industrial society, because well-paid industrial jobs were lost, but they were replaced by secure, well-paid jobs in management, law, medicine, education, journalism, entertainment, research and development. Things were going well. And when I was in graduate school, there was this optimism, apart from the fact that nuclear war could destroy us all if we came to that. Apart from that, the economy seemed to be doing quite nicely. Things have taken a turn lately. We have mentioned briefly 4 phases, 4 types of economy: hunting and gathering society, agrarian society, industrial society, service society, or post-industrial society, as it was often called. We are now entering a new phase of society that I call artificial intelligence society. And this is fundamentally different. If left to market forces alone, artificial intelligence tends to make human labor force increasingly precarious. This is not just, as I hinted at this on Monday's lecture, it's not just the working class industrial workers that are being replaced. It's all of us. Virtually all jobs are in danger of being replaced. This is actually, the artificial intelligence society has huge upside potential. A book by Ray Kurzweil outlines a very promising, wonderful future where we can live 500 years, and we will have nanorobots that repair your heart and cure cancer and all sorts of stuff. And I think this is true. We could have very good lives. But there is a downside that we are experiencing. The human labor force is becoming increasingly precarious. It is going the way that industrial workers went. They are really down to an amazingly small minority in advanced industrial societies. And this is a problem we need to cope with, and we are not yet coping with it. We're even hardly aware of this problem. It is becoming a major problem. We see symptoms in the chaos of American politics and in Brexit and in Donald Trump and in the rise of xenophobic authoritarian political parties like the National Front in France and the Danish People's Party and on and on. The symptoms are emerging, and they are symptoms of a problem that is poorly recognized and poorly analyzed. I would say the root cause, the immediate cause, is linked with globalization and the industrial forces, the workforces of rich countries are competing with the workforces of low-income countries as an immediate problem. But in the long run problem, the problem is artificial intelligence. Even China, classically sort of the scare story of the low-cost workforce, is now closing down factories that make consumer electronics and computers and stuff, and replacing Chinese workers with artificial intelligence, with computer programs. Even China is doing this, and this is the long-term future. In the short run, we are threatened by low-cost labor in China and India. In the long run, the problem is artificial intelligence, which has the potential to make the human labor force precarious. If left to market forces alone, we will have we could have a situation in which corporations make big profits by doing away with the human workforce, having it all turned over to artificial intelligence, which works very cheaply. Electricity is all they eat, and they don't make demands for medical education, medical care and long-term pensions and so on. They are very industrious 24 hours a day. So if left to market forces alone, humans have diminishing bargaining power, but this is not a story of doom. I would say it's a story of very real problems, but they are soluble problems. In democratic polities, growing resources can be harnessed to maximize the quality of life. It is not that we're all getting poor. This artificial intelligence society is creating huge amounts of wealth. The economies are growing. Even though they're competing with China and India, there's this genuine problem. Globalization is a real problem. Transition, the rise of China and India, absolutely real problem, but it's not the ultimate problem. In spite of competition from China and India, the U.S. has a growing economy. The stock market is high and the profits of the corporations are high. The human workforce is not doing well. What is happening is the people who direct the corporations, the people at the very top, are able to squeeze the human workforce increasingly. Their bargaining power is diminishing. We'll send it to China if you don't take our terms. Or we'll replace you with computers. And the bargaining power of the human workforce is eroding. The people at the top are able to make huge preparations for the corporations. Corporations look like they're doing great. GNP for the country is doing well. But most people are not doing well. What's happening is there are economic gains, but for the past 30 years, the economic gains have gone almost entirely to the very top. The corporations are having nice profits, and the presidents of the corporations are getting rich. I mentioned this shocking statistic. It really blows my mind. I hope it excites you too, that in 1950, the president of the average big U.S. corporation made 20 times as much as the average worker. This was seen, if China, where the ratio was 4-to-1, viewed this as scandalously high. Okay, whether it was high or not, it looks modest compared with today, because the ratio has gone from 20-to-1 to 273-to-1. The inequality has gone through the ceiling. It's 15 times as great as it was in the 1950s, when the economy was doing fine. Economic growth is humming along, people were doing nicely. Apparently, a ratio of 20-to-1 is fine enough to provide incentives, and it keeps the managers on their toes and hustling. You don't really need a ratio of 273-to-1 to prevent the managers from falling asleep. It is not that I want to slaughter the managers. I actually have respect. Both brothers were managers of big corporations, so I can't really hate them. But I have great respect for the managers. They are basically decent people, but we don't need a ratio of 273-to-1. Going back to this 20-to-1 ratio is quite adequate. Thus, I agree basically with Bernie Sanders. We need to redistribute income. His programs, I would say, are a recognition of something that I find obvious, and that actually the American public is starting to find obvious. Both political parties have been jolted by this. Donald Trump I think he is not as gifted as Karl Marx, let's say. His critique is build walls and keep the filthy Mexican rapists out of this country. That's his solution. I don't think this is a brilliant analysis, but he's dealing with a real problem, and his constituency is mobilized by a real problem. There is a real problem. Donald Trump's solution is not going to solve it. I think that the keeping the Mexicans and the Muslims out is not going to solve much of anything. It will build hostility between the U.S. and Mexico and the Islamic world and so on. It will make us unpopular, and I don't think it'll solve problems. There are solutions. I think it's basically a political problem, and I think that conservative economists claim we have to leave it to all the market forces. This has been a mantra, and this is not an idiotic claim. Let us admit that the state can be too big. I think the Soviet Union and the experience of 70 years of communism demonstrates that state-run economies don't run well. It is not that I want the state to do everything. I definitely don't. But it's that we have to strike a balance between too much state intervention and too little. You can get both. And I think we have moved to the point where we have too little state intervention, where at this point, the gains are going to the 1% almost entirely. And both political parties, the Republican Party almost blatantly has become the party of the 1%, camouflaging itself by talking about those dastardly Democrats are in favor of same-sex marriage and abortion and murdering babies and cultural issues, which, again, I don't scoff at cultural issues, they're genuine things, but it's kind of provided a convenient fig leaf for the Republican Party to conceal the fact that they have become the party of the 1% with policies that I view as very, very biased in favor of the top. The Democratic Party is less completely captured by the 1%, but let's face it, it is not. Big money is influential, even in the Democratic Party. Bernie Sanders represented a valiant effort to take over an existing political party on behalf of the 99%. This is the wave of the future. I don't see him as providing the whole solution. You know, big problems like the rise of artificial intelligence society are not things that one person single-handedly comes up with a whole solution to. I think Sanders recognizes the need for reallocation, redistribution of resources. I think that's true. And that who's going to do it? Our market forces doing it. Blatantly they're not. I mean, blatantly. Market forces since the 1970s, when our beloved Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher took power, and in some ways they did things that should be done. I think there can be such a thing as overregulation. They cut back on this. They overdid it to the point where it's become a religion of the Republican Party and the forces of the right in general that market forces alone should solve everything, and they don't. This has always been true. They didn't solve everything, even in hunting and gathering societies or in agrarian societies, and industrial society survived in large part because an organized movement of the left emerged that was able to impose political reallocation of resources in a way that built a healthier, better educated society. I think what we need is a balance between too much and too little state intervention, and I think this is the problem we need to find, we need to solve. This is, so, left to market forces alone, humans have diminishing bargaining power. So, reviewing this a little bit, inequality reflects the balance of power between elites and masses. We've been over this. I don't know why I'm still saying this. Okay. Early industrial society was dominated by a small industrial elite. Urbanization enabled the working class to mobilize for effective political power that reallocated resources. And I think this is a sort of model of what needs to be done. We need a political solution in which the interests of the 99% are represented, and there is no party representing the 99%. It was interesting. Bernie Sanders got a lot of following and a lot of enthusiastic following, trying to mobilize on behalf of the 99%. So this is a problem that is beginning to break through. He didn't win the nomination. I would say, at this point, do we grumble or do we go behind Hillary? I would say, for sure we go behind Hillary, because Trump is so much worse that, you know, it's not even a tough choice. I don't love Hillary, but I will surely vote for her. So this is where we are in the US at the moment. Okay. Virtually all the gains in recent decades have gone to the top 1%, evoking cultural backlash, Trump, Le Pen, etc., and a call for redistribution through higher top taxes. Let's review the rise of a class-based left. This is a model. It is not what we need again, because the working class has become a tiny minority of the workforce. Having a working class-based left is no longer feasible. We need one that represents the interests of most of humanity. Of more or less the 99%, we'll never get all 99%, but if you get a big share of them, you can have an effective coalition that can take over politically and can do some of the redistributive policies that I think are needed. I've given some thought to the kinds of policies that would improve the situation, and clearly, the government could reallocate resources in ways that create jobs for humans, and in ways that improve the quality of life and the environment and public health and mass education and so forth. In the 19th century, a politically and 20th century, a mobilized working class brought about diminishing income inequality. This was undermined by something that I have long heralded and loved. The rise of the welfare state made economic redistribution less salient. People were no longer starving to death. There was no longer a desperate working class ready to revolt to bring about change. The working class became fairly comfortable in advanced industrial societies because of the very policies that left parties had implemented. Moreover, an intergenerational shift made post-materials values increasingly widespread in high-income countries. I've talked about the many positive aspects and consequences of this. The rise of environmental protection, the rise of gender equality, the rise of gay liberation, of tolerance for other people, tolerance of diversity. Many positive things have flown from this. The rise of democracy, this last wave of democratization, demonstrably, is linked with rising post-materialist values. Greater emphasis on free choice helped motivate demands for democracy. The book Chris Weltzell and I wrote demonstrates this at great length. That's what the book is about. This has a downside in unintended ways. The classic left-right distribution was of left parties advocating economic distribution, welfare state policies, and right parties, conservative classics, opposing redistribution, wanting to reduce government spending. This looks like the Democrats on the left, Republicans on the right, and you can do the story in Germany. We have the Linke Partei and the Social Democrats on the left and the Christian Democrats sort of left of center, but by American standards, but comparatively on the right, and the Free Democrats clearly to the right. And then there was a new politics dimension that cut across this and weakened this left-right polarization by introducing new issues. It's not that the new issues are bad. I emphasize, I strongly support the new issues, but they attracted attention away from the classic left-right polarization. This was inevitable. There's so much attention available. New parties arose. On the new politics side, there was green parties emphasizing environmental protection, gender equality, rights for gays and immigrants. And from the start, they evoked a reaction. They evoked a national front in France and in Germany, Republikaner, conservative, xenophobic, authoritarian parties opposing new values, reacting against the rise of new values. And again, it is not just a sort of idiocy. This was a mobilization of people with traditional cultural values who saw correctly that some of their key values were eroding. This is a real phenomenon. The traditional role of women was eroding. They didn't stay home and bake cookies, and they were going out and having jobs, and it is in some sense tragic if this is what you know and love, and this was changing. There was real change. What's interesting is that in the 70s and 80s and so forth, the dominant phenomenon, one that attracted attention, was the rise of the Greens, the rise of environmentalists. The Republikaner and National Front were fairly small. They were seen as a nasty kind of right-wing reaction, a new right, it's not the classic right, but they were seen as a sort of fringe movement. Today, what is visible is that this xenophobic authoritarian reaction is powerful. The biggest party in France at the moment is the National Front. The biggest party in Denmark is the Danish People's Party, which is a xenophobic authoritarian party. To my horror, in recent surveys, Donald Trump is leading Hillary Clinton, and he is a perfect manifestation. I don't think I think there's a temporary phenomenon. You can count on a sort of a bounce from the Republican convention. I am convinced, though certainly don't guarantee, that by November the American electorate will be sensible enough to elect Hillary Clinton. But let's say things are looking tough right now. We have a very powerful right-wing authoritarian xenophobic movement in the United States that has captured the Republican Party nomination and currently is leading in polls. This is serious. So this right-wing, by no means the classic right-wing, but let's say it is called populist politely. One could call it xenophobic authoritarian, I think a little more accurately, but it's widely described as a populist movement. And this is a powerful trend. Why has this become so powerful? Partly it's because post-materialists emphasize new non-economic issues that cut across class lines and emphasize that causes as the anti-war movement, environmental protection, and gender equality. And they became increasingly prominent, and emphasis in the political party programs shifted from economic issues. This is a big database developed by one of the students in this program. Do you remember his name, Ed? His name is escaping me.
Alexei Zakharov.
Say it again.
Alexei Zakharov.
Alexei Zakharov, right. I owe this graph to him. I want to credit him, and thus my flawless pronunciation of his name.
Oh, very good, actually.
Thank you. He came up with this in the printed version of this I circulated. Tracing the salience and party programs of 20-some political parties, 20-some countries with many political parties. He, based on the party's election manifestos project, he found over time from 1950 to 2010 a fundamental crossover. About 1984, there was an enduring crossover where non-economic issues surpassed economic issues. Up to that point, economic issues had almost always been dominant, and since then they have given way largely to non-economic issues, which these new issues are important. I think they're great, I celebrate them, but they distracted attention from the classic economic issues, which we need to pay attention to too. Class voting declined substantially. This is something I was predicting way back in my youth, and it happened. The rise of the new issues cut across the classic left-right and introduced, on one hand, many members of the middle class moved to support post-materialist issues, whereas there was a working class reaction against cultural change, and they shifted to authoritarian right parties. The net result was that in many industrial societies, including the US, class voting, which once was high, went down quite substantially. Even Sweden, which has been a stronghold of organized working class and social democratic parties, class voting went down to about half its former level. This is partly the story of the weakening of the classic left, which it's always a balance. I think the rise of post-materialist issues was unquestionably good. But it's always a balance. We have to pay attention to economic issues too. The globalization, as I've mentioned, first of all, percentage of industrial workers declined. Classic Marxist parties became hopeless. If you just get the working class vote, you get 12% of the vote. Globalization further weakening the bargaining power of Western workers, competing with China and India and so on. Emphasis on economic redistribution declined since about 1970. Income inequality has risen dramatically in most industrial societies. The economic gains of the past few decades have gone almost entirely to the top 1%, the top 10%, and mainly the top 1%, so that today, shockingly, income inequality in the US is even greater than it was in 1900. And if you remember the stories of sort of the repression of the workers, the Pullman strike, the really dreadful repression of the working class in 1900 in the US and countries in general, the fact that income inequality has gone back to being even greater than it was in 1900 is a shocking finding. This is a graph of the top decile share of total income. This is taken from Thomas Piketty's book. Actually, the graph is mine, but it is based on data from his book. And it shows that there are interesting trends. First of all, there's been a decline, more or less everywhere, of income inequality until about 1970, and then a rise almost everywhere. But it varies from country to country quite significantly, reflecting the fact that this is in large part a political question. It is not inexorable economic forces. It reflects the institutions of human societies. In the US, we used to be a land of opportunity with less income inequality than European countries, particularly Sweden was quite high. The US has had rising inequality for a bit of a while and then sharply declining income inequality until about 1970, and now rising to an even higher level than in 1900. Sweden, on the other hand, used to be more equal, had greater inequality, and Sweden has had an increase in inequality, like almost all countries. It partly is in the nature of the artificial intelligence society. But the Swedish institutions have much more reallocation of resources. The US has had a ideology of championed by Ronald Reagan, embodied in the Republican Party, leave it all to market forces. This is almost, God says, leave it all to market forces. It is almost not just a matter of, my opinion is this, no, this is a moral question. It's a religious issue. Thou shalt not have government intervention. It has become a knee-jerk principle, which I think it's always a balancing act. You can for sure get too much government intervention, and you can for sure get too little. We're at a point where we need more, in my opinion. So this graph shows the basic trend. It also shows it is contingent in significant measure on the policies given countries adopt. It is not the sort of, it is hopeless, we cannot do anything about it. And this is, let's go into some statistics. There has been rising income inequality. In 1979, the top 10% of U.S. earners had a real mean income of $144,000. And in 2012, they had $254,000. In 1979, the bottom 90% made $33,000 in real income, controlling for inflation. In 2012, they made $30,438, a decrease. It is not that market forces are, because the country's getting richer, everyone's getting richer. In fact, the bottom 90% of the U.S. has gotten poorer. This is almost heresy, because conservative economists claim that if GNP rises, that's the only thing that matters. We should, in fact, another shocking statistic is, in terms of household net worth, property income is unequal, but ownership of property is much more unequal. The top 1% of the top 1% of Americans own as much as the bottom 90%. The net worth of the 400 richest Americans is greater than the net worth of 60% of the US households. This is not trivial differences. These are huge differences. Since the collapse of communism, inequality has risen even more sharply in Russia and China than in the US or Great Britain. China and Russia now have huge income inequality. The term oligarchy is not inappropriate to describe these economies. They have huge income inequality, even greater than the US. So this is not just a US problem. It's not all the fault of Ronald Reagan. I would say the collapse of communism in both countries, though China pretends to be communist, it clearly isn't. Then, do you remember The Wizard of Oz, where Toto pulls the curtain? The wizard is behind a curtain manipulating this, the great and powerful Oz commands you to do this. And then he pulls the curtain and it shows that it's this little man pulling levers. 5 minutes, okay. Basically, pay no attention to that man behind the curtain, says the wizard's voice, and you see it's all phony. Okay, this, in my opinion, is what conservative economists are claiming. They argue we should pay no attention to rising inequality. The only thing that matters is whether the economy is growing. If it does, everyone will get richer. And who cares if inequality is increasing? Pay no attention to rising inequality. Actually, the claim is that market forces alone will make everyone better off, but they're not. It is claimed that though industrialization led to the decline of the agricultural employment, it created even larger numbers of high-paid jobs in the industrial sector. This is true. It did. Similarly, conservative economists claim the shift from industrial manufacturing will create large numbers of high-paid jobs in the knowledge sector. But it isn't. Although the decline of industrial jobs has been more than offset by rising unemployment in the service sector, it's producing relatively poorly paid jobs. Jobs in the high technology sector are well paid, but the percentage of people working in this sector has been flat in the last 25 years. This is a real surprise. We are not finding a boom of employment in the high-tech sector. This is a surprise because everyone knows this is a booming part of the economy. People like Mark Zuckerberg are billionaires before they're 30 years old, you know. We're all getting rich. Well, not all of us. Mark Zuckerberg is doing well, and he's a good guy. And Bill Gates has done very well, and I have respect for him. But neither Bill Gates nor Mark Zuckerberg thinks we should leave this all to market forces. They and some of the more enlightened members of the 1% are aware this is an unhealthy tendency, and they are not in favor of no more reallocation. They think reallocation is necessary, and they plan to leave their fortunes, or 99% of them, to charitable foundations as a form of reallocation. They could just turn it over to the government, but I think they may be smarter to turn it over to the Gates Foundation. I suspect the Gates Foundation is perhaps better run than the government. I'm not sure. Anyway, what's happening is we are not having a boom in the high technology sector because it's the snake that swallows its own tail. High technology is marvelous. It is so good that we are developing computer programs that write computer programs better and faster than people. That's why we're not having a booming employment in this sector. It is really good. I would say having lots of resources is a great thing. It empowers humanity if it's used well. It's a question of allocating and using the resources properly. Same thing that I just said. High technology sector has been flat in other countries for which data are available. Basically, there is some variation from country to country, but over the period since 1995 to 2011, total employment in the information and communications technology sector has been flat. And I think this is not just a fluke. I would say the nature of high intelligence is it can create itself. We are getting computer programs that do computer programming even better than Boris. Boris, in the long run, I think you have a great future, but in the long run, you got to watch it. This is, oh, 1 minute, my God, I've got 15 slides. Okay, I'll go very quickly. 50 years ago, the largest employer in the US was General Motors, earning an equivalent of $50 an hour in real money. Today, Walmart, the biggest employer, pays about $8 an hour. We're not all getting richer. The real income of less educated workers in the US has been stagnant. The real income of working class white males have actually declined. It is no coincidence they're Donald Trump's most fervent supporters. Appallingly, the real incomes of people with university degrees have been stagnant. It used to be true that if you had a higher education, your future was golden. This is no longer so true, and we need to do something about it, and we can cope with it. Here is the real income of people by educational level. Since 1991, even people with college degrees and postgraduate degrees have had a flat real income in the US. This is almost heresy. It can't happen, but it's happening. We need to and can, and of course, is anyone doing well? Yeah, the 1% is doing fabulously well. The CEOs are doing extremely well. I would say the real conflict today is not between the working class and the middle class. That's old stuff. It's between the 1% and the remaining 99%. And I think Bernie Sanders, though I disagree with him on building tariff walls, I think he's right on hitting on the head. We need more reallocation. The polarization is between the 1% and the 99%, and the 1% are winning so far. So there's signs of hope. Publics of most countries, this World Values Survey data from the earliest to the most recent survey, they have been growing increasingly concerned with income inequality, feeling increasingly we need to do something about it, from an era when half the publics thought we needed more income differentiation for incentives to most publics have moved toward greater concern. The rise of Bernie Sanders is an obvious example that this has hit the US. The changes Sanders proposes go in the right direction, but I think they don't go far enough. Market forces are moving toward an economy that doesn't need a human workforce unless the state creates jobs. I can imagine many, many jobs for humans that would be well-paid, interesting, and useful, involving preschool education, environmental protection, healthcare, research and development, even the arts and humanities. Jobs can be created. Having lots of resources is a good thing, but they have to be allocated intelligently. If we go by market forces alone, quickly going through this, many bad things are happening in the National Front, Brexit, the rise of Donald Trump, motivated by an interaction between insecurity and cultural backlash, and a new coalition based on the 99% could redirect the state to allocate an increasingly large GDP to creating useful jobs. I count on your generation to do this. Thank you.
All right, we have maybe about 10 to 15 minutes for questions and answers. And, okay, Andrei, then again.
Thank you for your presentation, for your model of artificial intelligence society. In recent years, some European countries, especially Finland and Switzerland, were discussing and even experimenting with the concept of unconditional income. Mm-hmm. It means that every citizen is eligible for a special benefit that is unconditional to any status, unemployment, mm-hmm. disease, or so on. So how can be this idea incorporated to your concept?
It reflects an awareness that we have a real problem. Do we need to reallocate? I would say no doubt about it. Question is how? I think there's actually a somewhat primitive way of doing it. I think it will require imagination, intelligence, and trial and error to develop ways where the state can create jobs. I would rather create interesting jobs that are useful to society than just handing money. I think people will feel better and will be more useful and psychologically healthier if they have useful jobs contributing to society rather than just handing them money. Handing them money is easy to do. It has that advantage. I think if this group spent a week, we could come up with a bunch of very useful programs where we would use human beings to do useful things and we would pay them decent and secure salaries. There are loads of ways humans can be put to good use. And I'd rather have this done, although it requires a lot more effort and organization than just handing over money. But I would say Finland and Switzerland are recognized as a real problem. Tatiana?
But just to continue to this, a special question, but this money that you want to, to create the jobs, it will be a state job, so from government, or from where? From
I
where
think I would
you
not
find the
want the
salaries?
government, okay, very good point.
And incidentally, the Swiss have turned out this on the referendum. Yeah.
It's an interesting event, recognition of a real problem. However, I don't think it's the ultimate solution. I think sort of, it's a fairly crude solution, but it's simple. We just hand them money. I think that the jobs should not be run by the state. I think that the state has always done, let's say, subsidizing useful programs. Even in the United States, the beacon of capitalism, transcontinental railroads were built by federal land grants. We gave land to build railroads. State universities were built as land grant institutions. They didn't get, in that days we had a lot of land and granted land to fund very useful state universities that initially improved agrarian technology, vastly improved breeding and seed and fertilizer, and made American agriculture highly productive. I think what I would envision is grants that independent corporations or organizations would do the actual business rather than having it run by the state, which I think is a dubious idea. I think that the state can reallocate resources, but I would not want the state doing all of the things.
Gena.
Maybe there is alternative explanation of the rise in far-right populism. It can be explained by a special theory of issue voting, which states that if old parties do not take the agenda, which do not take the new agenda, and the new agenda is about migration attitudes and all these things, and because old parties didn't take this new agenda, and the Trump, in Trump's case, it works too, because Trump is not a very member of Republican Party. So maybe this rise is just the result of a big ignoring of this question by big parties, because it's socially, it was like not socially acceptable yet to speak and to discuss this problem. And maybe, and that's why we've got new parties and new politicians, and they are very viable, and that's why it's not the rise, maybe it's just the reaction of party system.
Thank you.
I would say that immigration is a real problem. This is quite obviously a genuine problem. It causes all kinds of things. And there has been a certain rigidity in handling it. I think for humanitarian motives and in light of the Holocaust of World War II, there's been a reluctance to limit immigration. I think realistically, there are limits to how many people any country can absorb. So I think this is a real problem. Donald Trump's conceptualization of it, I think, is primitive, but I would acknowledge that immigration is a genuine problem.
Okay. Perhaps the last
Okay.
two
questions, but let's take them in a bunch because we are running out of time. So
Just
make your
very
questions
short.
not too long.
What do you think will happen to Sanders supporters? Could they organize into some new third party in the US or something like that?
Thank you. And Tatiana?
Yeah, my question is about the calculation of this big inequality. You mentioned 76 and 2000 something, right? So, but recently there are huge part of migrants in the US, right? So I'm just wondering if you try to compare, for example, Native Americans and their income in 76 and now, would be some kind of gains in terms of income inequality, for these households?
For immigrant households?
No, for natives.
For Native Americans, no.
No.
Basically, most Americans have had stagnant or even declining income in recent decades, in terms of real income, controlling for inflation. I think that in regard to Bernie Sanders' followers forming a new party, I think this would guarantee Trump's victory. I hope it doesn't happen. I think that his effort to take over an existing party, and he came fairly close to succeeding, is much more intelligent. Splitting off as a competing faction of the left would pretty much guarantee that the right wins. So I think I'd much rather have Sanders-like forces take over the Democratic Party and then actually be able to govern, rather than turn things over to Donald Trump with appalling possible consequences.
All right. Well, Ron, thank you very much as always.